it's never too late to greet him. Since time immemorial, in an old house south of the capital, things happened that defied all logic. It wasn't a grand mansion or a forgotten estate, but a modest home with high ceilings and brick walls that over the years had witnessed countless stories. 3 generations of women lived there, the grandmother, her daughter, and her granddaughter. And with them something else. Something they had never seen, but whose presence was impossible to ignore. For as long as her mother could remember, strange events had taken place in that house. Objects disappeared without explanation, only to reappear in impossible places. Chairs moved on their own, doors slammed shut without any apparent draft. Small damages no one could attribute to human hands. But the most unsettling part was the nights. Because in the darkness of the house, when silence should have reigned, laughter could be heard. Sharp, mocking laughter, accompanied by tiny footsteps stomping furiously on the floor. Knocks on the windows. Whispers in the corners. For the mother and grandmother, everything had an explanation. A goblin lived in the house. It wasn't a fairy tale or a story to scare children. It was a certainty. Over the years they had learned to live with it, to respect its rules. The most important one, never enter without greeting it. It didn't matter if the house was empty or seemed quiet. One had to say good afternoon or good evening when crossing the threshold, because if not, the goblin would get angry. And when that happened, its fury was undeniable. The girl's mother had instilled this in her from a young age. Always greet, my child. We don't want to upset it, she would say as naturally as others warn about traffic or rain. And throughout her childhood, she obeyed. She did it without question as part of her daily routine. But as she grew older, doubt took root in her mind. She was logical, skeptical. She didn't believe in superstitions or bedtime stories. The idea of an irritable goblin hiding socks and tangling hair seemed absurd to her. And with the rebelliousness of adolescence, she decided to challenge the family tradition. One day she simply stopped greeting. One afternoon, while working on a philosophy assignment at my friend's house, her grandmother was looking for her keys to go run some errands. She checked the small ceramic bowl at the entrance where she always left them, but they weren't there. Frowning, she searched the pockets of her apron. Nothing. Did you take my keys? She asked her granddaughter. No, Grandma, she replied without looking up from her notebook. The old woman sighed and murmured with amused resignation. It must have been him. I looked up, puzzled. But my friend just rolled her eyes in exasperation. Grandma, please. I already told you those things don't exist. You probably left them somewhere else and forgot. The grandmother didn't argue. Her expression was that of someone who knows a truth others refuse to accept. While my friend went to fetch her own keys to lend her, the grandmother leaned toward me and whispered, "She doesn't want to believe, but I know what's happening here. Ever since I stopped playing with him, he's gotten mischievous. He hides things from me, moves the furniture. It's not my memory failing. It's him, and he's upset." Before I could respond, my friend returned with a set of keys and handed them over. "Here, use mine." The grandmother accepted them and headed to the door. Before leaving, she paused at the threshold and gave us a warm smile. "Be good, girls." And then, in a barely audible voice, she added, "See you soon." She wasn't speaking to us. She was speaking to him. The door closed behind her, and at that moment, a dull thud echoed down the hallway. A hollow, dry sound as if something small had jumped from a great height. My friend paled. And for the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed her face. Though the doubt flickered briefly across my friend's expression, she quickly convinced herself, or at least tried to, that it was just something falling. Nothing more. I watched her warily but chose to ignore the incident. However, what the grandmother had told me kept circling in my mind like an insistent echo. And maybe that's why I started noticing things. I don't know if it was my imagination playing tricks on me, or if my senses, once indifferent, had suddenly sharpened. Perhaps it had always been there, at the edge of my vision, in the background murmur, waiting for someone to pay attention. Because I heard it. The unmistakable sound of keys falling to the floor. My eyes locked onto my friend, waiting for her reaction. But she kept typing on her laptop, oblivious as if she hadn't heard anything. The house fell silent. Only the intermittent keystrokes and our voices discussing the assignment broke the stillness. But something felt off. I sensed it at the nape of my neck, in the thick air, in the uncomfortable feeling of not being alone. I forced myself to shake off the thought, and after a while, I got up to go to the bathroom. The hallway was dimly lit, and halfway through, I saw it. A set of keys scattered on the floor. I crouched cautiously and picked them up. They were cold to the touch. All of them were made of gray metal except for one. A golden one. I turned them in my hands, puzzled. Had this caused the noise earlier? I looked around. The rooms were closed, the windows secured. There were no hooks or shelves from which they could have fallen. Yet there they were. I stood up quickly and entered the bathroom, shutting the door behind me. I had just turned on the faucet to wash my hands when it happened. Knocking. 3 knocks. Given with knuckles. Firm. Precise. "Yes, baby?" I asked, thinking it was my friend. Silence. "Not a what is it?" I insisted, louder this time. Nothing. Not a single sound. Only the running water. I swallowed hard, turned off the faucet, and with a racing pulse, twisted the doorknob. As soon as I opened the door, I found my friend standing there. Her hand was raised, ready to knock. "I was going to ask if you wanted juice, lemonade, or coffee," she said casually. My stomach clenched. It hadn't been her. Even so, I forced a stiff smile and said lemonade would be fine. I followed her to the kitchen, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. But as soon as we arrived, another unsettling detail added to the list. My friend clicked her tongue in annoyance and grabbed a cloth. The sugar jar was tipped over on the counter, its contents spilled like a white blanket. She picked up the trash can with her other hand and started cleaning, irritated. "It fell," she murmured. But something didn't add up. The other jars remained in their place, their lids tightly sealed. Salt, coffee, spices. Only the sugar jar was open. I looked around for the lid and found it. It was on the floor, several steps away from the table, near the stove. I bent down and picked it up, holding it between my fingers. Something about it unsettled me, as if it carried the mark of a silent joke. I stood up and handed it to my friend. She took it with the same puzzled expression I likely had. "Thanks," she whispered, placing it back in its spot. But we both knew it hadn't been an accident. Though my friend tried to convince herself that everything had a logical explanation, the unease on her face betrayed her. I said nothing, but the feeling that something unseen was watching us grew stronger. That night, long after I had left, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend. "You won't believe what just happened." I sat up in bed and responded immediately. "What happened?" She took a few minutes to type. Then the message appeared on my screen. "I just heard something. I don't know how to explain it. I'm in my room and I heard a laugh. But it wasn't my mom's nor anyone I know. It was like a child's, but mocking. It came from the hallway." A chill ran down my spine. I wrote to her immediately. "Go to your mom's room. Now." My friend took a while to respond. When she did, the message was dry. "I'm not doing that. It must have been the neighbor's TV or something." I pressed my lips together in frustration. I didn't want to argue, but I knew. I knew it wasn't the TV or the wind or a coincidence. I knew he was there. My friend stopped replying. I didn't insist, but I spent the night uneasy, holding my phone, waiting for a message that never came. Nights in that house were no longer peaceful. At first, it was a subtle feeling, a faint tingling on her skin, like someone was watching her from a dark corner of her room. But with each passing day, he felt more present, more insistent. One early morning, she woke up with a strange sensation on the back of her neck, as if small fingers had run across her skin in a mocking caress. Her heart pounded as her mind wrestled between fear and logic. "It must be my imagination," she told herself, squeezing her eyes shut. But then she heard it. A soft, quick sound like small footsteps running across the room. It wasn't the floor creaking nor the house settling, no. They were steps. Agile, restless, circling her in the dark. She held her breath and the sound stopped. Summoning her courage, she reached for the lamp switch on her nightstand. She turned it on with a click and the yellow light flooded the room. There was no one there. But something was wrong. The things on her desk were out of place. Her laptop, which she had left closed, was now open, the screen glowing. Her books were on the floor, some with their pages bent, as if someone had flipped through them carelessly. Her wardrobe, which she always kept neatly organized, had its doors ajar and her clothes in disarray. Her heart skipped a beat. She got out of bed, a mix of fear and anger bubbling inside her. "This can't be real," she muttered. She searched every corner of her room, but there was no sign that anyone had entered. She stood still, scanning her surroundings, trying to find an explanation. And then she saw it. Her dresser mirror, where she looked at herself every night before bed, had something that wasn't there before. It wasn't her reflection. Not exactly. It was a shadow, a blurry silhouette standing right behind her. She spun around instantly, heart pounding in her throat, but there was no one there. When she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. That was enough. She rushed to grab her phone and texted me, telling me what had happened. She wanted me to give her a logical answer, something to calm her down. But I only wrote a single sentence that made her shudder. Say hello. But she didn't want to. Not yet. And he knew it. That night she barely slept. She forced herself to think of something else, repeating over and over that there had to be a logical explanation. But deep down she felt that something in the house was waiting. When she woke up the next day, her body was tense as if she hadn't rested at all. She got up heavily and went to the bathroom without even looking at her room. But when she came back, she knew something was wrong. The window, which she always kept closed, was wide open. The morning air made the curtains sway gently. And then she saw it. Her clothes, the ones she had left folded on the chair, were scattered across the floor, as if someone had thrown them in anger. The drawers of her dresser were open, and on her desk, her laptop screen flickered, as if someone had tried to use it. Her stomach tightened. She took a step toward the window and felt something under her feet. She looked down. The keys. The same ones I had found days earlier in the hallway. But this time they weren't just lying on the floor. They were perfectly aligned in a straight line, leading from the door to the center of the room, removed from their keyring and arranged in that strange, deliberate pattern. A shiver ran down her spine. She could no longer deny it. He was playing with her. He wanted her attention. And then a sound froze her in place. A whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but she felt the cold breath on the back of her neck, as if someone was standing too close. She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Her mouth went dry. She grabbed her phone and texted me again, her fingers trembling. Things are getting worse. I think I need to get out of here. But my response was simple because it was obvious what he wanted. It was what her mother and grandmother had taught her all along. Don't leave. Just say hello. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She didn't want to. She couldn't. Then the mirror creaked. And this time the shadow didn't disappear. No matter how much she moved, no matter the angle, she could no longer shake off that figure. I never understood why she simply didn't leave her room and seek refuge with her mother or grandmother. Was it her ego? Her stubbornness? Her need to feel in control? I don't know why she was so reluctant to accept that what was happening was real. But how else could she explain it? That night, her sleep was light, restless. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt someone watching her from the darkness. An inexplicable cold settled in the room. She turned in bed, searching for her blanket, when something made her freeze. Footsteps. Again, she thought. Small, quick, as if someone barefoot was walking on her carpet. She swallowed hard. The sound stopped right beside her bed. She held her breath. Her skin prickled when she felt a slight tug on the sheets, as if someone were trying to uncover her. And then, a finger. A cold, bony finger slid gently over her arm. She stifled a scream and shot up, desperately turning on the light. Nothing. Her room was completely silent, but something was off. She approached her desk, and on one of her notebooks, right on the cover, in clumsy, childlike handwriting, written with a red pen that lay among her scattered things, something was written. Say hello. Her blood ran cold. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone and texted me. I was asleep by then, and honestly, I didn't hear anything that night. I can't. This is too much. Then her screen flickered. The phone shut off. And in the reflection of the mirror behind her, she saw a tall, hunched shadow. A freezing breath brushed her neck. And this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl. Oh, hoarse. Impatient. Salu. The bulb in her lamp exploded. Darkness swallowed her. Even so, she decided she wouldn't give in. She locked herself in her room, checked every corner with her dead phone in hand, and lit a candle beside her bed, as if a small flame could ward off something she couldn't even see. But he had waited long enough. At 3:33 a.m., the candle went out in an instant as if someone had blown it. The cold returned. This time there were no footsteps. No whispers. Only a sound. Breathing. Long, deep, right in her ear. She pulled the covers over herself, trembling, refusing to accept what was happening. Then the bed creaked. The mattress sank as if an invisible weight had settled beside her. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. And then, a whisper. Not a drawn-out one. Not a moan. Not a command. A greeting. Sweet, playful, like a child who had been waiting for a long time. He. The air grew heavy, the pressure on the mattress increased. Something unseen tugged at the sheets, slowly, inch by inch, exposing her face. She couldn't scream. She couldn't move. A cold breath brushed her cheek. And a voice, now deeper, rougher, more impatient, whispered with something that sounded like a smile. Your turn. She didn't think twice. With a voice broken, choked by terror, without daring to open her eyes, she whispered. Itch itch hi. The weight vanished. The air turned warm. And in the darkness, just before the candle reignited on its own, she heard the laughter of a child. A triumphant laugh. He had won. My friend never ignored him again. Even I started greeting the empty air whenever I visited her house. It was something everyone did, and I didn't know if it was right to ignore it. I wasn't part of that family, nor did I live in that house, but I didn't want to pick fights that weren't mine. And he, satisfied, never bothered again. Or at least, not in the same way. Predator and prey, and the thrill was in the waiting. Jared adjusted his gloves, exhaling slow and steady. He had been watching her for weeks, tracking her routines, memorizing her habits, learning the details that would make tonight effortless. He wasn't reckless, wasn't sloppy. His work was clean, and she was perfect. She exited the cafe at exactly 9:17 p.m., just like always, tugging her scarf tighter against the cold. A creature of habit, moving through the same predictable steps. She would walk 2 blocks north, past the pharmacy, where the streetlights flickered just enough to cast gaps in the visibility. That's where he would take her. Jared smiled to himself. This was what separated him from amateurs. The patience, the precision. He had planned every variable. No witnesses. No cameras. No mistakes. He stepped into the shadows, keeping distance, moving with the rhythm of her footsteps. The city swallowed sound well. His presence was nothing more than a ripple in the night. She didn't look back. She never did. His hand brushed the hilt of the knife beneath his coat, fingers curling around the worn leather grip. Another block. Just a little closer. Then something changed. Something wrong, unusual, unpredictable. Jared's pulse skipped. It wasn't her, it was the space around them. A shift, barely perceptible, like the air had thickened. His instincts flared, a prickle at the back of his skull. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street. A drunk stumbling out of a bar half a block down. A couple laughing on the opposite sidewalk. No one watching. Still, the unease settled in his gut. His fingers tightened around the knife. He quickened his pace, matching hers. Almost there. She reached the dark stretch of sidewalk. His moment. He closed the distance, exhaled, prepared the grab. A shadow moved. Behind him. His stomach clenched. Too fast, too silent. His instincts screamed, but he had no time to react. A shape moved inside his blind spot, something shifting in the darkness that shouldn't have been there. He spun, half a breath away from drawing his knife. A sharp whisper at his ear. Sloppy. Pain ripped across his throat. Jared choked, the knife slipping from his grip, his own breath wet and gurgling. His hand flew to his neck too late. Blood pulsed hot between his fingers, spilling in thick, stuttering bursts. He staggered, knees hitting the pavement. His vision blurred. Footsteps stepped over him, unhurried. Measured. Someone crouched just out of sight. A voice low, amused. Did you think you were the only one hunting tonight? Jared's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His body slumped sideways, eyes darkening to voidness. The last thing he saw was the blade sliding cleanly back into its sheath. A sheep's mad bleeding. Which one? Gableman whispered. He was sweating. The 3D printed gun felt heavy in his pocket. The girl, said Odd. The girl was eating alongside her parents, or who Gableman assumed were her parents. She's so young. I don't know if I can do it, he said. Are you sure? A few people looked his way. It was a Monday morning and the diner was only half full. Gableman was alone in his booth. He hadn't touched the scrambled eggs on the plate in front of him. Of course I'm sure. Don't you believe me? Said Odd. No, it's just. The whole enterprise rests on faith, said Odd. No, I know, whispered Gableman. More patrons looked his way. No wonder he thought they all think I'm talking to myself. He took some egg into his mouth and chewed. Part of him hoped the girl would look over too, they'd lock eyes, and in that moment some understanding would pass between them. I just thought that, maybe because it's the first one, you could give me some kind of sign so I know I'm doing the right thing, Gableman whispered. Absolutely not, said Odd. And again Gableman wrestled inwardly with the strength of his belief, his conviction. It had been 1 week since Odd had first appeared to him in the form of an angel, and commanded him to manufacture the gun to offer the sacrifice. What? The sound of distant sirens interrupted him. He considered whether someone may have called the police, and beads of anxious sweat ran down his back, but concluded it was unlikely. He hadn't done anything yet, which meant he could still walk away, dump the gun somewhere and try forgetting everything. After all, the gun wasn't a murder weapon yet. But what about the angel? It had seemed so real. the illumination and the revelation so divine. And he, of all people, had been chosen. Well? Asked Odd. The sirens drifted by again, distantly. The girl was eating, drinking and laughing and talking to her parents about her friends from school. Then the bell by the entrance rang. A policeman walked in. And in that moment Gableman acted, got up, walking towards the girl, took the gun out of his pocket, pointed it at her. Her parents stared at him. She stared at him, started to speak, and he fired 3 times. Bang, bang, bang. The girl slumped dead in her seat, her body draped by that of her wailing mother. Her father, his face speckled with her blood, froze, as 2 thick and curled horns issued from the top of his head. Ram's horns to match his newly ramified face and ramifying body. The mother's too. Everyone had become a ram. Everyone but the girl, whose reclining body became instead that of a dead female lamb. God, what have I done? Gableman yelled, the gun falling from his front hoof. But God did not answer. And Odd laughed. And Gableman's words? Why, they were nothing more than a sheep's mad bleating. Mezen and Jonas the killer's creepypasta. In a large mansion called the Stud's Mansion there was a very bad family called the Stud's family. It was made up of 4 members. Mr. Stud, the father of the family, Mrs. Stud, the mother of the family, Mezen Stud, the oldest daughter of the family, and Jonas Stud, the youngest son of the family. Mrs. Stud and Mr. Stud didn't want to have children, but they ended up having them anyway, and by having children they had a lot of responsibilities, things they didn't want to have. They could no longer spend all their money on trips, expensive shopping, events, casinos, motels, bars, or even drugs, which was what they liked to do most, and this made them furious, and so they decided to punish those children by making their lives hell. Since they were born, they never had the attention of their parents because they ignored them, hoping that those babies would die of hunger and thirst. But the indignant employees took care of the poor babies until they were 7 years old, and this infuriated Mr. Stud, who expelled all the employees and called the police, accusing them and arresting all the employees. Mezen was 8 years old and Jonas was 7 years old when the real hell began. It wasn't one thing at a time, but everything started at the same time. They were now the employees of that mansion, and they were forced to clean that entire mansion, the floor, the carpet, the dishes, the toilet, the attic, the TV, the walls, the refrigerator and the stove. It was Mezen who cleaned. The one who changed the light bulbs, who took out the trash, who cleaned the basement, who swept the kitchen and cleaned the pantry was poor Jonas. The Stud's children could not speak, could not hum and could not fail in their duties. They were constantly receiving a great beating from their parents. Jonas was constantly hanged with force by his father or beaten with an iron belt or hurt with angry punches accompanied by insults and false accusations. Mezen received the same treatment from her father, in addition to having her arm exposed to the stove fire as a threat, having shoes and slippers thrown at her by her mother and dishes by her father, and if it was not physical violence it was verbal, as they were constantly yelled at them, calling them worms, demons, destroyers of dreams, or simplicity, nothing. They were called literally insignificant. If they failed in some of their duties they were punched by Mr. Stud until they passed out and were thrown into the basement for 3 weeks with only scraps of food to eat. They had no Christmas, they had no Easter, a punishment called life that lasted until Mezen turned 12 and Jonas turned 11, all for having taken away their parents' freedom. Mezen, at 12 years old, was already a dirty girl with blue eyes and curly brown hair, and Jonas was already an extremely pale boy with long black hair. One night, Mr. Stud was punching Jonas in the stomach because he was making noises with his teeth, and this bothered Mr. Stud. It was then that something broke in Mezen, like a line separating madness from sanity. Mezen screamed with fury and madness and jumped. Her eyes were the red of the purest anger. She ran to her father. She jumped on top of her father and slapped him in the face while screaming that he was nothing, that he was alone, and that now he was dead. She bit, she kicked and she held Mr. Stud's neck with all her strength while screaming in madness. Mrs. Stud, horrified, tried to throw plates, pots and forks at the out-of-control girl, but something was wrong. Mezen seemed to feel no pain from this. In fact, it seemed like she hadn't even realized she was there. Jonas was terrified of his sister and curled up on the floor crying, repeating, bad family, very bad family, bad family, very bad family. Mezen opened his jaw frighteningly and with all his strength bit his father's neck, making a large jet of blood gush all over the living room floor. Mr. Stud? He screamed in pain and Mrs. Stud fainted in terror. Mezen got off his father with his mouth full of blood and ran to his brother. "Oh, my beautiful little brother, let's get away from these weaklings' house and taste the wonderful taste of fresh air with our mouths full of blood. Ha 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 ha." His smile was disturbing, with blood in abundance but also pure terror in abundance. She really found it all very funny because she couldn't stop laughing out loud. Then Jonas took his sister's hand, still scared, and together they headed towards the streets, opened the door of the house and fled that property. They ran out of the structure and disappeared into the night as they ran down the dark street. Mrs. Stood remained unconscious while Mr. Stood called emergency services with a desperate hand. He cursed the name of the Stood's children and wished that they would meet the worst of men in the streets and have a dark and evil fate. After 2 long hours the ambulance arrived and helped in time. It was not too late to help Mr. Stood. When the doctors arrived, Mr. Stood was almost passed out on the floor around a huge bloody pool, and he did not stop muttering very angrily, "Mezen and Jonas, you damn brats, you deserve to die for this." When Mr. Stood woke up, he was in a hospital bed next to Mrs. Stood, who was still unconscious. He looked around and saw a doctor who was monitoring the heart rate monitor and some papers in his hands. Mr. Stood asked what was happening and where he was, and the doctor turned and reassured him, saying that everything was fine and that the wounds that Mezen had caused him were already healing, but because of the place where the bite had been made he was in pain, but in a few days he would recover completely, while Mrs. Stood was just unconscious from a strong emotional shock. Mezen's name made him boil with resentment. "I never said I would have let them live even another day," Mr. Stood said bitterly. His anger was visible, very visible, but because he hadn't completely recovered, his anger ended up putting a lot of pressure on him and he ended up sleeping for a short period. When Mr. Stood woke up, he soon noticed that something was very wrong in that small and fateful room. The walls of the room were completely red and the lights were flickering non-stop. Obviously those lamps were very damaged, but then he got up a little tired, but he got up from the bed and looked back in the direction of his wife's bed, only to see Mrs. Stood all dismembered on the bed with her jaw forced open. All the skin from her face, belly, hands and the entire front of her body had been ripped off, and all that could be seen was a pure flesh corpse with the body parts stretched to the maximum and nailed to the bed. Mr. Stood screamed, then Mr. Stood cried, and finally he vomited out of fear and disgust. He moved as far away from the terrified corpse as he could and ended up bumping into the wall, and to his horror it was covered in something wet and sticky but warm, so he turned around and finally noticed that the red on the wall was blood. It was pure warm blood. "This has to be a nightmare. I'm still sleeping. Wake up now, Melvin Stood, wake up." He banged his head trying to wake up, but this wasn't a dream, not a dream he could escape from. He left the room through the hospital corridors, screaming for help, but the hospital was empty and dark, with literally no light bulbs on the ceiling. There was only light in one room, the room where Mr. Stood left, because all the rooms had their lights off. All the doors were locked. Mr. Stood tried, but none of them would open. Mr. Stood suddenly noticed that a strong smell of smoke had risen up in the corridor. Something was burning somewhere, but he didn't pay any attention to it. He tested all the doors in the entire corridor until he reached a door, the exit door, which for some reason was shining with a golden glow. "Is this the way out of this nightmare? Am I free and can I wake up?" Mr. Stood asked himself, and immediately ran and opened that door without hesitation. The flames grew wilder after Mr. Stood opened the door, burning half of Mr. Stood's face. He fell into screams of pain, and what he thought would be the exit turned out to be a corridor engulfed in flames with the bodies of doctors and nurses skinned and impaled on the wall, their eyes and jaws missing. Mr. Stood ran into the flames, looking for a path without fire, trying to save his life, and after running and running, he unfortunately ended up tripping and falling face first into the ground. When he raised his head, he tried to look ahead in a last hope of seeing an exit, but instead he saw in the middle of the flames 3 black figures looking at each other. A girl, a boy and an adult, and the 3 were holding hands until they slowly turned their heads towards Mr. Stood, and he could see that all 3 had something in common. They all had bulging eyes and an abnormally large and psychotic smile. Mr. Stood stood looking at those figures still and motionless while they watched him until they disappeared amidst the flames. Mr. Stood began to look for them amidst the fire, and then from the flames in front of Mr. Stood the 3 grotesque figures with their smiles cut off jumped laughing at Mr. Stood and pinned him against the burning ground. Mr. Stood was terrified, of course, not only because he was being attacked but because the ones who were attacking him were his children. Mezen and Jonas were both right in front of him, but now they were terrifying. They were pale, completely white, and their hair was completely black. Mezen had a huge smile cut across his face and his eyelids were no longer present, dressed in a red and yellow striped shirt and blue pants. Jonas, dressed in a white hoodie and black pants, was with an abnormally large smile cut across his face, and his eyes were those of a psychotic, and among them was a young man with completely pale skin without eyelids, with a big smile cut across his face and black hair, wearing a white sweatshirt dirty with blood, and along with Mezen and Jonas holding a bloodless kitchen knife. Mr. Stood's suffocating screams of pain and regret echoed throughout the hospital, asking for 2 things: help and forgiveness. The hospital caught fire and burned incessantly without stopping while the 3 killers watched from outside. "Daddy, where are we going now?" Mezen asked. "Where are we going now, Daddy?" "I'm tired," Jonas said. "My smiling little angels, now let's go home," Jaff exclaimed. There was thunder in the attic but sunlight outside. On the other side of wet windows that my fists could not break I saw a summer's day, yet here I was trapped in the flesh house, where a storm raged. Lightning flashed and spread like cold blue veins across the skin like wallpaper, peeling off the walls, revealing a framework of old yellowed bones. Elsewhere other children played on soft grass on a Saturday afternoon, and I pulled open the trapdoor and descended. The ladder too was of bone. Hard, brittle. I left the storm above, but the wetness followed me down, pooled in the upstairs hall so that my bare feet touching ground squelched on carpet already saturated with attic juice. A white rat scurried past, yearning for abandonment, hunted by a horde of razor blades. Before it reached the stairs, they'd cut him open, turned him inside out and were slicing up his outward innards. The rat was still alive, shrieking, "Thou shalt not kill." I looked into the bathroom. The sink had regurgitated my few happy memories into a hideous, unidentifiable sludge. The mirror was a night sky, starless. The porcelain tub had been stained permanently pink, and biomass dripped from both faucets into the drain, from which emerged, slithering, crawling, irregular masses of flesh and hair and crescents of cut nails. They processioned single file out and down the stairs. I followed them. The carpets were even wetter here. Juices reached my ankles. The living room smelled of sweat and worn-out bodies. Although empty, his shadow stalked along the walls. In the kitchen, the door had been forced off the refrigerator. Unplugged, it still buzzed as the flies inside slowly eliminated the face of Mom's severed head. People used to say we look alike. On the granite countertop worms writhed in a corroded steel meat grinder. The oven, heated, felt deceptively like a womb. If I closed my eyes I could almost feel the bestirred air of all the beatings of the wings of my imagined birds flying past. Like they would, for real, outside, in the fairyland of unsluiced love and ordinary laughter. My soul's on green grass. My friends, sunshine, my innocence. "Where are you?" my father demands. He's home. And I am hiding again. His presence is preceded by the sandalwood scent of shaving cream and dread of the despicable intimacy of smooth skin. Today I break the sixth commandment. I hear the storm in the attic. I am the storm. I see his face, handsome and boyish. No one could ever suspect, could ever know. Holding a razor blade so tightly my hand bleeds I cut him. No. The blade hits glass, I groan, and in the mirror I see my own reflected middle-aged face. "Are you okay?" my wife asks from the kitchen. I hear our daughter play. A few drops of blood hit the white porcelain sink. "Fine. Just nicked myself shaving," I say. But there is a darkness in me.